Bowery Capital Startup Sales Podcast.
Hey everyone, welcome back to the Bowery Capital Startup Sales Podcast. We've got a really interesting topic and guest on for you today. We've got Ulysses David with us. He is the former Global VP of Strategy. He was the GM of India at a company called Dataku, which many of you are probably familiar with. We're going to talk today about leveraging India to scale your adoption and growth. So Ulysses, welcome to the show. Thanks for coming on.
Thank you for having me.
Before we jump into the topic, can you just tell us about your background, what you've been up to professionally? That would be super helpful for the listeners.
Sure. So, I've been in the data space for over 18 years now. Spent the first half of my career in the financial services industry. I worked in risk and regulatory reporting, helping organizations across the globe, primarily banks, build credit models and regulatory reporting models. And through that, I moved on from a tech role to more of an account management role. And that's when my career then shifted to a customer success function and customer experience. And at my last organization, Dataku, I led customer success delivery, then moved on to help scale out the organizations globally, primarily in India.
So I know that you've moved on from Dataku, but maybe share a little bit about some interesting things that are going on over there, and maybe also just in the broader sort of data landscape as well.
Okay. The data landscape has definitely matured a lot over the last decade or so. It started off with a whole focus on big data and just like folks trying to get access and being able to manage such massive amounts of data. And where we are now in that landscape is actuating and activating this data and making it useful on a day-to-day basis for various organizations. And, Dataku comes into the picture where it enables enterprise organizations to democratize access to AI itself, the whole big data analytics and advanced analytics on this data that organizations have been able to collect across the board. And Dataku's primary mission is to upskill folks across the data vertical in different organizations, enable them to make sense of the data that they have, and break down silos that have cropped up in different organizations with just different analytic silos that exist in organizations. Dataku helps break down those silos, improves collaboration, and makes it easy for organizations to operationalize these analytics that they're able to have on the data.
And before we dive into the topic, for folks listening in, what is one thing that nobody listening here is going to know about you?
There's going to be a few things, but I think what could be relevant to the topic at hand is the fact that I speak 4 languages and can fake a couple more. That does.
What are the 4 languages?
What are the languages?
It's English, Tamil, Hindi, and Portuguese, Brazilian Portuguese.
Very cool.
Yeah.
All right, so let's jump into the topic. Tell us about your early career, how you started to understand this theme of leveraging India.
So, while doing my consulting career, I worked with both large banks and small credit unions, and I realized most of the global organizations had back office presence in India. It started off back office as back office, and then it moved on into more business oriented processes. And and being from India, it was easy for me to find success at these organizations because I was able to both interact with the folks out here in North America and also interact with some of the support staff that were based out of India. And as I moved into account management and customer success, and this was at an organization called Talent, where I managed some global organizations. While doing that, we were planning out a year on the countries that we wanted to expand into. And as we were doing this, we did a routine audit of where our users were. We wanted to know, which pockets in America, across the globe, not just America, but across the globe, where our users. And we realized that 30% of the actual users of the product were based out of India. And we didn't sell into India. We didn't have any customers out of India. But what had happened was a lot of our American organizations that were our customers had users that were based in India that were using our software. And so when the leadership realized that, so they changed. It had to change on a dime. We realized that we have a massive potential in India, and we needed a support system to be set up in place. And we moved into India. And at that time, one of the goals was also to establish a virtual CS organization, and we realized India would be the perfect place because we already have this usage, so we can scale that up. So I was part of the team that helped set that up. So for me, that was, for the broader CS group that I was part of, that was definitely something that helped us, the light bulb moment for us when we realized that India has a big potential.
And you had mentioned at the beginning that you had started out your career in tech. Maybe talk to us a little bit about, when did you transition into more of that sort of customer experience focused role? Talk us through that transition.
I worked for a boutique consulting organization that worked with banks. And so initially, my focus was on making sure the solutions that we're building for these banks work in the different environment. And as I was doing that, I realized that the success of any project or any engagement was not just a solution that worked, was not just the tech that worked. It was important for the success of the people that were involved in it. And I would say, as I realized that, I found the challenge of helping people becoming successful a little bit more interesting and fulfilling for myself than just like figuring out which tech stack would work best for different solution. And I would say maybe 4 to 5 years into my consulting career, I slowly progressed into it. We had a very open workplace. I was allowed to wear multiple hats. So then it was just easy for me as I got better at account management for me to take over managing some of our largest customers globally as a consultant. So.
Hey, Ulysses, one thing that we had talked about, in sort of prepping for this meeting, maybe just expand upon your work at Talend. I think that would be really cool for the listeners to understand. You do have this kind of aha moment in terms of the user base analysis, the audit you were going through. Maybe just expand and talk us through that as some of the starting points that sort of build on getting to India.
Okay. So, the audit itself was pretty routine. We were typically, what would happen is when we're talking about where our users are located, most organizations would just look at, okay, this organization is headquartered in New York or somewhere else, and we would just assign the users to Americas or to EMEA or to APAC. What had happened during this particular audit, we had looked at, where the software itself was pinging us. And then we realized that even though we were tagging people as saying this is an American user, they were actually utilizing it in India. And not only that, we had, during this audit process, we were talking to our customers. And for me personally, talking to the champions, as we call them, the primary super users or the owners of the product in the organization, and finding out, hey, how can I help you be more successful? How can we help build a community around this product? And they're like, yeah, it's great that we are having this conversation, but I have 40 people in India, or I have 30 folks that are working out of Bangalore or Chennai, and working for the North American part of the organization. For me, it was not easy to even leverage or enable these users who are halfway across the world in a different time zone. So as we came together, it just became clear to us that we were leaving, a lot of enablement on the table, and that like all of our efforts in North America were not going to impact this 30%. And when I'm talking about 30%, it was not 30% of the American user base, but 30% of the global user base were out of India. And what we also realized was that our global expansion strategy was based on GTM factors, as in where are we going to sell, like which countries are we going to go to sell into. So India was never part of that equation back then, and I'm talking quite a few years ago. India has definitely come up now, where different organizations think of India as a sales region, right, like a tier 1 sales region right now, which wasn't the case a few years ago. But back then, if you're not a tier 1 sales region, we were not planning about going into India. So that was the aha moment for us, and this was also a period when customer success was nascent in its growth. It was a new thing for SaaS organizations, and we were all as a customer success organization, we were all trying to figure out, what does it mean? Is it just pure account management? Are we going beyond old school account management to what does customer success mean for us, for a SaaS organization? So this was just part of that growth.
Sure. And if you were to kind of just bottle up the lessons, I think listeners can kind of understand the narrative as you talk through them. But maybe upon reflection, now that you've been out of Talon for a while, what do you think were some of the lessons there in terms of usage and CS and things that anyone listening to this should really pay attention to?
So I can speak to my own personal lessons out of this, because I was really focused on how it impacted my own portfolio on this change. What I realized, the first piece was that there was a pretty big gap on our enablement and community building processes when we are focusing on American organizations just in America, and leaving out a big chunk of the enablement, or the users that need to be enabled, and the folks that need to be part of the community that we are building for our software. So that showed me that India was important. And the second piece was even at Talon, when we decided to go in, we were still looking at India as a low-cost hub where we could establish a virtual CSM program that would, we still had to make a case to our investors that this is of value. So we had to attach North America into the equation. So virtual CSM program tagged on saying, hey, these folks that we would hire in India would also support folks in America. So that's how we made the ROI case. Now that I have had a chance to expand and fine tune this, I would say the ROI is in and of itself is just in India itself, where we have this low hanging fruit of driving growth by having people on the ground, because of the time zone differences and the cultural differences of trying to enable them and building the community from America is not as efficient.
Tell us a little bit more about the transition to Dataiku. Why did you make the move? And maybe talk to us about how you came to use the same playbook there.
The first was personal. Dataiku was a Series B at the startup when I started the conversation with them. Similar to Talon, they were a French startup, which made the transition, so much more, because it was the same talent acquisition person who was a Talon, moved to Dataiku, then reached out to me. The fact that I could impact the trajectory of customer success at such a young startup was very exciting to me, and very attractive to me. The second piece was I tested out the Dataiku platform, and they had me hooked within a day. It was a very solid platform. At Talent, it was for me an evolution along my data journey, where while Talent enabled folks to get access to various differing data sources and manage that access, Dataiku sat on top of it and enabled business users to make business decision based on all these data points that we're collecting. So it was a progression for me in that aspect also. So that was very attractive to me.
Maybe if you could just walk us through preconceived notions, sort of, you've mentioned a little bit of this in the early discussion, but maybe just to cement it, would love to kind of learn a little bit more about why India and sort of what was going on there when you were sort of at Talent and at Dataiku talking through these things.
So India's role, has grown over the last maybe 2 or 3 decades. When India exploded onto the scene as a tech hub, it was not perceived as a tech hub, but like as a support hub for various companies. That's how the India tech revolution took off. And so the couple of preconceived notion was that India was for low cost, hiring, low cost recruitment of tech help. And the second preconceived notion was like, the Indian user base was all basically support personnel. So software organizations never really focused on it because, they're selling to business users, they're selling to decision makers who are based mostly in Americas or EMEA. And so India never, hit the radars of most sales folks that were used to selling just in the American context. But globalization has definitely changed how, the importance of India and various other countries, and we can talk about that, like various other countries as, the whole idea of this was to get the world to become flat, expand our user, who we can sell to. And I think we are marching towards that.
Got it. Okay, super helpful and definitely better context. What, maybe just to go back to these audits, like what are you ultimately, as you talk to maybe like founders you mentor and advisory work that you're doing, what are you ultimately going after? What's kind of the ultimate solve of this in terms of the actual audit and the follow through of it, if you were to kind of just crystallize it?
Yeah. See, the 2 key metrics that customer success organizations usually look at are the gross retention and the net retention rate. What are we trying to do? We are trying to make sure that we do not have downsells or churn, right? We are protecting the investment that our customers have made in our product. And more often than not, when it boils down to is what is the usage of the product at these customer places. So this is where this is why these audits are important, because it allows you to know what percentage of, whether it's a user license or what is the percentage of usage of your product at an organization, right? And as a customer success organization, you're trying to quantify what is the value that your customers are getting from your product. And one of that metric is the usage statistics. That helps the customer's leadership team understand if a product is sticking, or if it's just if this is just like a one-off user who wants to have this product. And there's a lot of consolidation that's always happening at these large organizations, not just large organization, any organization. And you want to make sure that your product is not getting the boot because nobody's using it, right? So selling is, I think selling or finding a new logo right now is just the tip of the iceberg of an interaction with a customer. And so the audits form a baseline on your interaction with the customers.
Got it. Maybe one point of clarification. Did you kind of make this whole thing up in terms of the audit, or was there a mentor or someone who sort of in terms of terminology, told you, oh yeah, that's just an audit? Like, what was, kind of the genesis of it?
No, I didn't make this up. This is something that most CS organizations do in one form or the other. And, a lot of times products themselves have, they don't necessarily call it an audit. They have ways of monitoring usage statistics. And most SaaS products have this already built into the product itself because they want to understand how customers are using their product.
All right. Very helpful.
Yeah. It's just taking a look at, a lot of times we look at data and like we say, okay, hey, this is the usage, right? Like we can just say there's a 70% usage or there's a 80% usage, and you're trying to get to 90%. At 90%, you're going to have expansion at that particular account. But it's then digging into the data is what was, what's important. And for me personally, I realized, and this is me getting to it, was that, hey, there's value here in digging deeper into the impact of India. It's also, this goes back to the question you asked, like, speaking those languages. I love languages because it helps me to understand culture. And when you work with global international companies, you understand that they are not a monolith. There's no one culture that impacts them. And so understanding various cultures helps a lot. And for me, understanding the Indian culture helped me just think about, what would it help? What would it do for me to have this relationship with these users that are based out of India? How would it change my relationship with my customer?
Can you walk us through some of the sort of early successes around enablement, new customer traction, and beyond?
Mm-hmm. So, at Dataiku, we were at a much early stage than where I was at Talent. At Talent, I joined just pre-IPO, and it was a much more mature organization, with a much larger customer base, right? At Dataiku, so I had a portfolio when I came in, which consisted of 5 of our top 10 accounts, and so they were also, some of them were global, and the first 6 months, as I got to know my portfolio, I started having these conversations, just like, because of my learnings at Talent, I started asking the question, hey, where are your users? And I wasn't just asking whether they were in India or any part of the globe, but just in the US, where are they located at? And because we are so small, one of my key goals was to build a strong community that would help me scale. Dataiku's license model is user-based, so I wanted to get as many people in the customer organization exposed to Dataiku as possible, and I knew the best way to scale that up was to build a self-sustaining community inside of my customer base. And so I started asking those "where are your users located" question pretty early into the customer journey. And I realized that one of our major customers had users in the UK, in Turkey, in Poland, in Italy, and India and China. And so, and of which the largest portion was in China and India. So, I just threw this at them saying, hey, you have around 50 users of your product in India. What would you think about me flying out to India and setting up an enablement day, so I can, expose the various functionalities of Dataiku to these users, and then potential users, right? That will enable you to be successful in what you're using with us. And it took a little bit of convincing because initially they were like, they themselves within the organization did not understand the power of India to the success of what they were trying to do, which was build out a self-service program. And so the first time they agreed, we decided we're going to do a couple of days of training, and then just product demos and all those things. And then because I was going down to meet with those users, I then asked a couple of my colleagues if any of their companies had users in India, and this was a question that was not asked before. So then they started asking, and then I set up a few more meetings, which made business sense for me and a few others from various part of Dataiku's offices to fly down to India. And one of the other things we also realized was that our GSI partners had pretty big presence in India. So this also was a good chance for us to enable those GSI user base that were at most of the global organization for us to have an interaction with them. So this was back in 2019, pre-pandemic. Went out there, and we were blown out by the response. Typically when we organize these, because it was not just users, we were opening it up to the community inside of the customer base. We had people sign up, and we were like, okay, we should expect maybe 40 to 50% of the people who signed up to show up. So one of our first major meetings, we had 120%, which was almost 150 people showed up, but we were expecting 50. So we had to scramble to make sure we were effective. But it just opened the eyes of my colleagues also, who came along with me, and so that was the first one. So, and then every meeting we went to, there was just so many questions, and there was something new that I realized, which I didn't realize at Talent, was that as a customer success professional and a leader in that space, oftentimes when we get into any organization, we get siloed into particular lines of businesses where we entered in, and it's really hard to make the jump into the whole enterprise and other lines of businesses. It takes quite a bit of time. But what I realized in India was that I had all these users from multiple lines of businesses showing up to these events, and suddenly we were getting exposed all across the organization. Because what happens is the Indian team tends to be the hub for these global organizations. So when software companies want to expand out, this is just an easy win for us. That like, hey, how do you go talk to multiple lines of businesses easily? How do you get introduced to them? Go to a horizontal that goes across the whole enterprise, and India was set up perfectly for that, and that was a pretty big learning for me and for Dataiku.
I mean, I guess kind of continuing along the same sort of line of thinking there, thinking of sort of software sellers specifically. How should they really be thinking about building relationships in India to really help the US further enablement and further retention?
The way I would look at it, you definitely have to see where your users are, right? Like that's important. Like don't just assume you're going to have such a big user presence in India. So you got to know your customer portfolio and understand, how they're using your product, whether if the product is in the data and analytics space, there's a pretty big chance that there's most of the global organizations have a big hub somewhere in India. Most, not all. So selling in, make sure you are able to speak to the experience of the user base or some of the influences that are based in India. And that'll make your sale smooth. It'll also impact the footprint that you enter an account with right off the bat. This is like it's a fresh sale. So, one practical way of doing this, which I've learned, is like when people introduce themselves and like on Zoom calls, don't just ask them what organization they're based out of, which organization they come from, what they do. Ask them where they're based out of. And that'll give you a pretty, big clue to, what the questions that you need to ask. Because there are different challenges for folks that work out of the US offices and different challenges for folks that work out of the India offices. Another winning, these are just small, I would say, people-centric activities that sellers can look at. It's like if you see that when you do a demo or anything else, like you have quite a few people that are coming from India, try to set up your demos for early in the morning. It makes their life easier, and it shows the team that's joining your call from India that you value them. And that is a very big win for any offshore company. And that could be not just India. If they're joining from Poland, it's the same thing. Try to set it up early in the morning, as early as you can. And those are small things that help you have some winning conversations.
Maybe just to round this out and kind of some closing thoughts. You've obviously done this now. Talend, DataKu. I'm curious, as you sort of shape the narrative, are there companies that you think that this works really well for? Is it sort of go-to-market motion? Is it international versus, maybe just kind of put the pieces of the puzzle together for the listeners. Conversely, like, are there companies that this just won't really work for, right? DataKu, as an example, very data oriented. You're mentioning sort of heavy India presence. Just reflect on that and maybe just help the listener understand kind of what are companies that this works well for, and maybe some that might not. You wouldn't want to necessarily go down this path.
Fair. There were multiple questions in what you asked me. I'm going to take one of the easy ones. Is this a go-to-market motion, or what is this? I would say this is an expansion motion and a retention motion. When it comes to customer success, I consider myself a growth-minded CS leader, which means that I'm not defensive when it comes to retention. I'm offensive. I want our partnership with customers to grow, and those are the kind of motions that I like to put in place. Because if you're growing at a customer, you're not worrying about churn or downsell because you're expanding, right? So India plays a pretty big role. Two reasons. One is there's an untapped potential of the users because we don't do the enablement. That's a low-hanging fruit. You're sticking. The more number of users that you get to use and experience your product, the stickiness goes up. The investment on that is pretty low when it comes to India, right? That's the first piece. The second piece is the what I realized, which is India is a hub. So from an expansion perspective, a lot of times you could get pigeonholed into one or two teams in the US organization. But India's value there is that you get to easily move into multiple organizations. So that helps with your, speeds up your expansion play at a lot of these companies. Now, when it comes to thinking about, who does this work well for, and other organizations that this wouldn't work as much, there are two questions to ask yourself. What is your customer base? If you're talking about global organizations, or if they are a big part of your portfolio, then India should be on your radar. The second piece is the kind of product. Like if you're in the data and analytics or any tech product, that would require pretty big tech talent or would require the interactions or partnership with GSIs, then India is important for you. Now, if you say that your product does not check these two boxes, then you could be in the minority of startups to whom India wouldn't matter as much.
Got it. Maybe in terms of just final thoughts, any like sort of big picture things we haven't covered, any kind of final stuff worth mentioning before we break?
I think, we had this discussion before this call, what are the countries that could be similar to an India for software organizations. To my mind, the top three, because this was something that I was thinking through for Dataiku in my last role. Some of the countries that come to mind are Mexico, Ireland, Poland. These are countries that American organizations have invested in building out a hub. And China also comes to mind. And those are, and I think in the future you probably see Portugal and maybe even Colombia in that mix, because those are starting to become strong tech hubs that can support American organizations. The other thought I have, India is growing. The number of unicorns in India are growing. So there might be a point in the future, maybe in the next 5 to 10 years, where India becomes a GTM strategy for a lot of startups, because the economic buying power is definitely increasing in India. And as we walk towards that, I would say India is a low-hanging fruit, and that's something to keep in mind for tech startups, that it's a low-hanging fruit because of the symbiosis between the American market and economy and the Indian market and economy.
Super helpful. Well, I think we've covered pretty much every piece of the topic that we wanted to. I hope the listeners now understand how to leverage India to kind of scale that adoption and growth. And Ulysses, thanks so much for joining us on the podcast today. We appreciate it.
Thank you for having me, Mike and Jess. I appreciate this time.